So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here today. Welcome to another event hosted by the Language Collaboratory. This is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures. And it's driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional development opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. Our series this fall addresses perennial issues of accessibility, inclusivity, and learner autonomy and agency through the lens of our current shared circumstances, and approaches these issues from a variety of perspectives, building on the expertise of individuals on our own campuses. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat, and during the open discussion period to raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning will be available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Before we start today's discussion, just a reminder that the next event will be held a week from today at this time. Just a minute. There we go. And hosted by the Language Resource Center at the University of Michigan on gallery walks, addressing the topic of learner autonomy and agency. Today's discussion comes to us from the University of Iowa Language Center for Language and Culture Learning and will be led by Claire Francis, the director of the center. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. As Dan said, I'm the director of the Center for Language and Culture Learning at the University of Iowa. It's my great pleasure today to introduce you to Dr. William Coghill Behrends. Dr. Coghill Behrends is a clinical associate professor of foreign language and ESL education. He's the co-director of the Baker Teacher Leader Center, where he focuses on global education initiatives. As a former high school German teacher, Will has always been interested in the way the world language teachers make sense of the various identities students bring to the classroom and how teachers make space for those identities in their classrooms and in the target language. So thank you so much, Will, for agreeing to be with us today. As we start off, I was hoping that you could talk to us a bit about what motivated you to study how language teachers make sense of LGBTQ+ identities and queer inclusive practices.
You betcha. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for having me today. It's nice to be with you. I think like most of you, we're in crazy times right now. And so I hope that my talk and some of the things that I'll discuss today will give us all a little bit of a break from some of the craziness that we're all experiencing. And so about 25 years ago, I was doing a practicum in a small river town here in Iowa to become a teacher. And I was introduced, a German teacher, by the way, and I was introducing something that can be kind of complicated for students as they're learning German called relative pronouns, right? And so we were going through the process of, sort of understanding what they were, et cetera. And one of the students in the class said, and I don't mean to offend anybody by this, but I'll just share what the student said. The student said, "This is so gay." And I think we all know, we've all heard that, right? That term and that phrase, and we know what people mean when they say it. And so I looked at the student sort of bewildered and squinted my eyes a little bit. And I said in German, "Wie bitte?" which means, "What did you say?" And he repeated, and I said, "I'm sorry. So you see, I'm gay. My partner is gay. There are many people who are gay, probably some in this classroom, but relative pronouns are definitely not gay. They're not even straight for that matter, right? Grammatical rules are not gay. And the people to which they refer can maybe be gay, but the pronouns themselves and the verbs and all of that stuff that follows, they're definitely not gay. Do you mean to say that it's hard, confusing, unlike English? Well, anyway, silence, as you can imagine, fell over the class. And this was, like in early 2000s. So, students were, I guess, probably not used to a teacher being so direct about that. Well, a few days go by and I'm in the school again, completing some practicum hours. And a group of students walked up and I recognized some of them from the German class. And they said, we just wanted to give you this award because a few days ago in German class, somebody said that something was gay and you responded in a way that let us know that, first of all, like that kind of talk was not okay. And that this is an important space for all of us in the classroom. And so we wanted to thank you for standing up for kids like us. And that lesson is something that is like stuck with me throughout the years. Every time I feel like a little bit nervous or a little bit timid about approaching a difficult conversation or a dialogue, especially as it comes to or deals with identity. But that situation reminded me how important it is for us to open our spaces in the world language classroom to make sure students know that it's okay to talk about these things. In fact, we need to talk about these things. And there's a way to talk about them that is, healthy and safe and affirming, right? In the end, like this is all about really our obligation to make learning possible by engendering language spaces that are open and affirming to a variety of identities that our students are bringing to the classroom. So I think that's like the real reason. Of course, being gay myself, right, I've always been interested sort of in that overlap between what it means to be gay in different cultures and how people make sense of that identity in different spaces.
That was, I'm sure I'm not the only one who was really kind of very moved by the story. I can imagine a small Iowa town high school very well, where I sent all my children in the kinds of spaces that we really need to carve out for children from a very young age, I think, too. And next question I have for you is, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that exist around queer inclusive teaching practices in the world language classroom?
Yeah, well, let's start with the opportunities, because I'm all about recognizing and valuing the agency of language teachers. First, and I said this before the talk when I was visiting with the organizers, is there a better classroom or space in a school or university that is more suited to deconstruct cultural and social norms and interrogate these ideas, academically, socially, emotionally, than the language classroom? I really don't think there is, because I think, these questions are essentially at the core of what we do. We do culture in a language classroom, and because of that, it's a prime space for us to give students an opportunity to practice cultural interrogation. It's no secret, we're all living in really interesting and challenging times. And one of the things we know about this work is that students have to feel connected to it. In other words, culture can't remain in the abstract like language can't, right? When we make opportunities for our students to show different ways of being in the world, different identities that people can have, including LGBTQ identities or Black, Indigenous identities, we're opening our classroom as a safe space in which these identities can be shared, created, understood, etc. So a good example of this actually is pronouns, which, Claire, when you sent me some of the questions, there were quite a few about pronouns. So let's just dig right in.
Yeah.
When we're working in a language that uses gendered pronouns, the question I want to ask us is, how can we flip the script so that we can critically make sense of what it means, not just for folks who don't conform or fit into those pronouns or those binaries, but for all of us? What opportunities and constraints do we have in gendered language, essentially? Sometimes we treat, and our students, grow up, when they grow up speaking English, not understanding English as a gendered language, right, with the exception of pronouns. And I think all of us now have probably seen the question, what are your preferred pronouns? And in fact, many of our schools have systems in place to make sure that students can identify those. Gender inclusive bathrooms are another example, right? And so this is something that's becoming more commonly understood, right? And the question then is how do students actually interact with those ideas if they themselves aren't necessarily somebody who is confronted face to face with gender transgressions, et cetera, right? And so in other words, the idea is essentially about kind of queering the system and making it not just about people who are or people who identify as LGBTQ, but making these questions actually questions that are relevant for all of us, right? So now if we think about this in the target cultures, you know, like we want to ask our students, are there similarities or are there differences? What does it look like when somebody doesn't fit into those gender binaries, perhaps if they exist in different cultures? You know, is that system painful for people who have to experience it? You know, in what ways does that system constrain our own ways of being? What language do we need, and do our students need to talk about gender in their own language and in the target language? So, you know, I think that that is really important. And there are lots and lots of examples to it. I mean, I think all of us here, our language teachers, are in some way engaged in language education, and it's not a stretch for us to immediately think of, you know, some of these questions about and around gender. There are sometimes, though, naive assumptions that students, you know, that we make, that students don't necessarily know how to talk about these kinds of things. But as teachers, like, this is what we do. You know, it's our job to give help and to create language around some of these complex ideas and model this language use. So in early language classrooms, right, we have to give a language for that, right? We have to create space. And so when we introduce different kinds of peoples or different kinds of identities, right, it's important to make sure that those introductions are inclusive of folks on the LGBTQ spectrum and what that might look like. So we have to, like, make this a normal habit. You know, another simple strategy is not just asking folks who have pronouns that I might misread to share with me their pronouns, but to ask everybody to share their pronouns, right? And to make that sort of a normal thing that we do, because what we want to do is, again, queer that script and not let it be an assumption that we're making, but actually always questioning those perspectives and the assumptions that we're making.
Yeah, I would just like to add, and it's sort of more of a comment, there's a really interesting way that in the French context that you can talk about the historic, the Académie Française came out against gender neutral language, right? And so you can do this interrogation of the power systems in play when there's this move towards more gender inclusivity, and how the French system actually kind of clamped down on that, right? And how do you find safe spaces there too? So it can be sort of a meta-linguistic and historical and analysis of power structures that can be very interesting as well.
You know, a simple Google search will reveal lots of examples within target languages. You know, there's some movement in Quebec, perhaps, to think about a pronoun that doesn't fall within the binary, right? And like, our language classrooms are always authentic spaces. And I know that there has been a lot of sort of discussion in the history of language instruction about what is authenticity, right? But if we don't see our language classrooms as authentic places where students can make identity, and we can actually ask them to be critical about identity and to think deeply into this, then their language learning remains on the surface level, and they might as well just do Rosetta Stone, right? If they're just learning phrases, right? I mean, the power in our discipline to really get students to think critically about who they are and what that means in this particular moment, in this particular culture, and when they're outside of those cultures are really important. In one of the studies I did, one of the Spanish teachers was giving her students a short story to work on. And the main character had a name that was unfamiliar to the students, meaning they didn't know whether this was a girl's name or a boy's name. And so they asked. And the teacher had not really ever actually thought about this. And I think she said, because she was kind of caught off guard by the question, and she didn't know historically what this name was. And so she quickly actually turned this into a really cool learning activity by actually asking the questions, you know, the students, you know, in addition to the comprehension questions that they had. She asked them, like, in what ways would the meaning of this story change, or the meaning that you all are making change depending on gender, right? And there were lots of really, like, interesting sort of tangents that the students went on, right? And it all brought them back to this question that the students, admittedly, according to the teacher, had never really thought about, which is how much they don't realize that gender dictates their lives, right? And the way in which they make and construct meaning across different, you know, spaces, et cetera. So it ended up being a really rich activity. And I think you know, if you've been in a high school language classroom, which is where I do most of my research, like these students are like chomping at the bit to talk about something interesting, right? Like they lead lives that are so complex nowadays, and they've just been exposed to so many different kinds of identities that to actually not talk about it is doing them, you know, a real disservice. And that, you know, leads me to sort of talk about the media, which is the way in which media can provide us such awesome examples of queer life, not just here in the US, but also around the world and within our target cultures, you know, and we can use these stories to help interrogate our own. So I can talk more about that, but
yeah, no, it's great. But part of this question was also the challenges. So what are, I don't think do you feel like you address the challenges, or do
well,
you?
no, maybe a little bit, but there are some challenges, you know, that are obvious. One of them, especially at the K-12 level, is this nervousness about the imagined parent, right? This invisible parent who is always sort of looking over your shoulder and in some ways surveilling what you're exposing their kids to, right? And so that is obviously a challenge. In fact, in the last study I did, the teachers that I interviewed actually all talked about this new level of surveillance they were experiencing, and many of them attributed it to the last presidential election and the period following that presidential election, where there were definitely, you know, sort of all eyes on education and the liberals who were working within education, et cetera, right? And remember, you know, I always come back to this idea that like, what's so liberal about talking about culture? What's so liberal about talking about, you know, all of the isms that plague our society? There's nothing really. And again, it's actually our job to make sure we're preparing our students for the lives and the people that they're going to encounter outside of schools. And so, you know, that concern is certainly one, and it's legitimate in many ways, you know, and so people need to know their context. But that sort of leads me to the next, which is, you know, this idea that the folks that I talked with in the study were really concerned about representation, and this idea of like talking about queer identities if they themselves didn't identify as LGBTQ. They had the same kind of trepidation about talking about race, right? And so many of the teachers, with the exception of two, were white. And the white teachers definitely felt so all kinds of nerves about talking about race and those kinds of identities in the classroom. As white teachers, right? And I think that as white folk on the call, or people of color on the call today, you know, we know that that question sort of goes both ways. So there were, however, two common traits to teachers who did and could, like, openly and without fear, talk about LGBTQ issues and even race issues for that matter. And the first and like most important and common one was that they had experience and felt a level of comfort with queer identities, LGBTQ identities. In other words, they themselves identified as LGBTQ, or they had family members or close friends who identified as LGBTQ. They'd actually spent time within the community, and it was actually more common for the teachers in the study to have spent, the white teachers especially, to have spent time in queer spaces than in spaces that were racially different than they were, right? And so again, that tension between, you know, doing the work and talking about racism or anti-racism versus actually just getting into the community and being with people who are different than you is an important thing. And the other group of teachers, well, sort of the same group, but another reason that sort of emerged from this was that they didn't treat sexuality itself as an object, right? So they didn't objectify or other the LGBTQ people, but rather, again, they queered that question and they made it about the significance of the question for everybody, right? So why is it important for us to talk about sexuality for everybody, right? Whether you're gay or straight or pan or whatever, right? Like they realize that like a gay identity doesn't exist without a straight identity, right? And the gay one is contested, right? But it's contested because of the straight. And so like we have to sort of like actually flip the questions and flip the script a little bit to get students to talk about that. So I think and there are many, many challenges, obviously. Probably all of us can name a few.
Yeah, I was wondering if you probably the curriculum, right? The textbooks and the way they're written is.
Yeah, absolutely. That was another one. In fact, the department that I was researching were in the midst of a curriculum review. And because they had been participating in these interviews, they were sort of primed when the textbooks representatives came to ask about, how does this textbook company, and again, this is for high school students, what the target audience, how does this textbook address LGBTQ identities? And the responses from the textbooks representatives ranged anywhere from, well, we don't, because we can't talk about it at that age, like it's too dangerous and it's too problematic and blah, 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 to, well, we don't talk about it because we want people to like imagine and create that identity like for themselves. Like we don't want to tell people or do this like hegemonic dogma thing about what it means to be gay, et cetera, right? And so, I mean, obviously that was like a cheap way to get out of the silence question, which is like, we don't talk about it because, we're silent on that issue, and that is dangerous. And so essentially none of the textbooks actually had anything about LGBTQ identities. And so that, especially for the high school market, is definitely something that is in need of, revision, et cetera. But all the teachers actually talked about, developing a skill set to think about ways in which they could, and teachers do this anyway, integrate and supplement their curriculum with other materials.
That materials that deconstruct the narrative of the textbook, probably in some way. Yeah. So you did your research with with K-12 teachers. Are there elements of this work that are just unique to that particular space, or that have a carryover to post-secondary?
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning, absolutely, right? Like this is a universal topic, and I think that our classrooms, more than others, are such ideal places for us to deconstruct these scripts and these narratives and introduce students to stories, to make space for the stories that they themselves might want to create. On some level, developmentally speaking, and maybe even historically speaking, there's been this fear about talking about LGBTQ identities with non-adults. Part of that is because we want to like sort of desexualize youth and adolescents, but I mean, come on, they are like, they're coming into their sexuality, right? And so they're probably more sex than any of us, right? In terms of like constantly thinking about what that identity is and what it looks like and how they make sense of it with their peers and with media and with society. And so, they're really, like I said earlier, chomping at the bit to talk about this. But we have to think about, understanding our students developmentally and asking, do they fully understand themselves as cultural beings? And I think, that's not something that's obviously homogenous. I've worked with high school students who better understood themselves as cultural beings than some of my college students or maybe even some of my peers. So, the one thing is, I guess, to understand that, lots of people are on different places. So it's not about what you're in or where your entire class is, but where individual students are, and so, and again, back to this point, like this idea that younger people are not capable of talking about topics around LGBTQ identities, or any other identity for that matter, couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, our students nowadays, especially at the K-12 level and definitely at the college level, are in the midst of really interesting, challenging, difficult times. And it's important for us to give space and to let them talk about those experiences within the context of our language classroom, and using culture as the object, right? Using our target language cultures as the object. What is this looking like over in Spain or France or Germany or whatever, the language it is that you're studying. So, understanding that. I do think that at the secondary level, we have really tremendous resources often available to us on our campuses through LGBTQ support or resource centers. A lot of folks across the campus, at least at Iowa, are working on LGBTQ issues and topics, and many of them actually embedded in unique and sort of culturally situated historical topics or themes, right? And so thinking about ways that you can introduce interdisciplinarity into this question and work, back to that question about teachers who don't identify as LGBTQ feeling like, oh, I don't know what to say or what to do. Like, it's about doing your homework and knowing that you don't have to do or say anything alone. Like, you can work with your team, and you can work with your department, right? For leaders who are on the call today, I think it's important for you all to ask yourselves, like, in what ways are we heterosexing or pushing this gender binary within our language practices, right? In what ways are our departments deconstructing some of this? And do our faculty and staff who are supporting our language instruction have the resources, the PD, the education, the experiences they need to do queer inclusive teaching in the context of language study, right? So, this is like everything involving identity, right? It's really fluid, and we sort of always have to stay on top of it and continue to learn about it. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here.
Well, we have a great comment from Kristen Beamish Brown in the chat. It says, I always ask myself if it would be inappropriate to talk about the same thing with heterosexual people. People talk about couples and marriage all the time without thinking about sexuality. Right?
Exactly.
And every textbook has a unit on the family without ever really going into, when I taught French in the past, so we go bring in a unit on how families look, and they're different. And I think that's a great unit to be able to flip the script on a little bit.
Absolutely. And many textbooks have weirdly introduce elements of the romantic, right? But those elements are typically, heterosexual,
Right.
And that reminds me of another interesting study where a student, excuse me, was trying to convey via use of a pronoun to a teacher that they had a boyfriend, but the teacher kept correcting them, saying, no, that's not wrong. That's not possible. You mean she, you mean her. And this went on and on until the student finally erupted in class and said, don't you get it? I'm gay. Like, I'm trying to say this, in this language, right? And that obviously created this moment where the teacher, who herself had identified as somebody who was sensitive to LGBTQ issues, got so caught up in our language policing, right, that they failed in that moment to sort of transgress the grammar and think about, actually, the student is trying to make identity. Like, that's really cool.
I see Dan reappearing, which is the signal that we're really close to 4 o'clock.
Wow.
I know that goes by super fast. I think it is, I wanted to open up the floor also to other questions, and there is another one in the chat. But we had talked about whether you could have one last word on directions for future research in this area and professional development. I think that would be a great little way to end. And then the other chat question is whether you have suggestions for identity related questions to ask when selecting for textbook materials. And maybe there's a miraculous way you can answer both of those questions in under 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, I'll begin with the next directions because I think this sort of answers the textbook question. The thing that I'm working on right now is understanding intersexuality, and there is actually intersectionality, not sexuality, intersectionality. And there is a lot of really interesting work being done right now about thinking about intersectionality as a critical social theory, and even actually approaches to thinking about it as research methodologies. And so I think understanding the different ways in which gender, race, immigration status, and all of those ways in which those identities are sexed and sexualized and gendered and engendered is really important. With respect to the textbook, I think it's important to just really understand your student demographic and ask the questions of the textbook companies. Textbook companies aren't actually going to change or include these identities unless we as language professionals begin demanding and asking for these identities to be represented in our materials. So
great. Dan, do you think we can have one or two, or if there's anyone in the Zoom who has a question that they're burning to ask that they have not put in the chat?
I would ask a quick question. So this is Joseph Droger from Beloit College. I have students who identify as trans who, French in terms of culturally where it's at, in terms of coming up with a gender neutral pronoun, is a couple decades behind where we are, and also doesn't have the easy, they, them pronoun. And then when you go into inclusion, you end up with these sort of slashes or dots and Ds that are pronounced outside of the way that French has historically been pronounced. And I just was wondering if anyone had ideas for trying to be inclusive without also being too confusing of the entire rest of the classroom, if that makes sense.
Mhm. I don't teach French, and so I would invite my French colleagues to chime in here, but I would say this, I was in a classroom once where a teacher was telling me about a student who was transitioning. They knew the student was transitioning, but the student was with peers who knew the student and had actually grown up with the student with their gender assigned at birth. And so the teacher had sort of this interesting balance of trying to maintain sort of the privacy of the student who was transitioning while also creating space for that student who was transitioning. And that ended up being problematic on some level because of the way in which also high school teachers often use skits and stuff and dress up, and people can put on and take off identities. And so there were some moments where students were almost like mocking gender identity in a way that, the teacher had to shut down. But any Frenchies here on the call who want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, just for context, it was interesting. We did introductory videos, and the student, said, this is my name, my pronouns are they, them. For French class, I'm using gendered pronouns. And so I was like, it was one of those moments when I was like, oh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say that the yell is becoming more a common usage. I mean, I knew that when I was at Grinnell College, I worked with some trans folks there, and they started using yell.
Yeah, and I think the student I had discussed with them, but wasn't quite comfortable using that in a class, which of course that means I'm not creating a space where that's possible.
I've tried to work with that an awful lot, and I just kind of tell my students, because I teach Spanish, and I tell them that there is no good way, but here are some options, and you can use them as you wish. And this is the one that I use. I write using the at symbol, so it's an A and an O. And I tell them, you can use this if you want to, you don't have to. In your next Spanish class, that might not be acceptable, but I'm just trying to make space for everybody.
I think that's a good thing to do, Kristen. Again, back to this idea of our classrooms being authentic spaces, and sometimes what outweighs sort of correctness with respect to grammar, to me sometimes is actually student identity. So I think that's awesome.
Aldolfo is telling me there's a hand raised in the room that I cannot see, but is that Anne? Did you have something? Yeah, there you go.
So that's actually the issue of pronoun and what we call inclusive writing in French. That's a struggle because it makes things very unreadable. And I've had that discussion with my coordinator as we are creating a new textbook that wants to be gender inclusive. Is what do we do? And so we've chosen to do a lot of different things. So we do have the median dot, and we do have an activity in which we explain this is what has been chosen by a bunch of publishing companies in France to show that. And then we also go into detail saying, well, you could use a hyphen if you want it. You can use the slash, absolutely. Because I mean, in the easy cases, the median dot is really clear. In the tough cases, like to in the plural, right? So you should be writing TOU dot TE dot S to be truly representative of what it's not readable, it's not decipherable, especially by beginners. Mm-hmm. So we've decided that we were going to use a variety of strategies, mostly the median dot, but in cases where it could be problematic for learners, we spell both. And we vary. So in a list of vocabulary, some adjectives will have the dot, some adjectives will have a slash, some adjectives will have both side by side. But we also have an explanation of what you shouldn't use the parentheses, because that's what a lot of people are used to. And so we have a reflection activity on why we do not want that. And we also tell them that this is new, that a lot of students, people, including teachers, are not used to it. And to me, that goes also with what we're trying to do, is that we're not trying to impose anything. We're just trying to give solution for those who choose to do that. And the first time I used that in class on my own, my students were like, what's the dot? And so I explained that. And then they're like, why aren't you using the parentheses? I'm like, really? Am I a parentheses? I'm a woman, I'm not a parentheses. And that was enough to say, oh my God, I'll never do that again. But that's that little teaching moment where I think that French is particularly annoying for that matter. Because we're not nice people to begin with. That helps. Well, I mean, to our defense, the French Constitution does not recognize minorities, so it helps not embracing them. So and that's also something that that can be brought to the classroom, is why are French people so reluctant to look at their language as something that can adapt to new realities? So to me, it's a really important thing to discuss, but sorry, I went way over time.
Absolutely. We're having, some people are leaving us. I think Dan wants to pop in here.
Yeah, I just want to say we come to the end of our scheduled session today. And first, I want to thank William for a really thought-provoking and provocative session. This is great. This has been a really good conversation. We will actually stick around for another 10 minutes if people want to keep talking. But don't feel like you need to stick around. Our session is over. Thank you all for coming. And please look for an email to fill in or respond with feedback on this session as well. Thank you all, and we hope to see you next week.